Hey, I'm Chris Blakely. If you're watching this video, it's probably because I sent you here or sent a link to you for this video, or maybe you stumbled across it based on a search. I just wanted to make a short little video to answer a question that I often get from students. I'm a college philosophy instructor, and I teach a lot of general education courses. That's mostly what my job consists of. And often students ask me, how difficult is your class? I usually get that question when the students are scheduling their classes for the next semester or at the beginning of a semester, and they're trying to figure out, how they're going to juggle all their responsibilities and what kind of time commitments they're going to need to make to each class. It's certainly a reasonable question to ask, and and one that you can get some answers to. So I wanted to make a little video to try to answer at least one part of that question a little bit. Of course, and here's kind of the caveat, the preface is that how difficult a class is depends on more than just how the professor or instructor designs that class. It depends on a lot of things that are particular to individual students. How disciplined of a study how disciplined are they with regard to studying? How strong are their reading comprehension skills? What sorts of testing or requirements do they do better on as opposed to tend to do worse on? Essays versus multiple choice tests or something like that. So how difficult a class is depends a lot on the particular students or the particular student individually. Having said that, there are still some things that you can look at to help you get a good idea of how difficult a class will be. So I've already mentioned, what kinds of requirements, what kind of graded requirements is the course going to have, and you could take a look at those, and of course some of those are easier than others, but again, that depends on particular students. Some people are really good and have strong writing skills, and so they do better on essay type classes or classes that require an essay. Some people have better and worse research skills, and some have stronger and weaker reading comprehension skills. And so, again, you should look at many of those factors. In this video, I'm just going to talk about one factor to look at, the type of stuff or the type of readings that that are required in the course. And so, at many universities, professors and instructors, so they can assign basically whatever they want, right? So so long as it fits the course description. Of course, professors want to assign things that are appropriate to the level of class or the level of study and to the discipline that they're teaching in. And so there's a wide variety within that. Even if different professors are teaching the same course, they might have different requirements. They might assign different types of works. And so again, what kind of reading they're assigning is one major factor that you can look at. So I just wanted to walk through a couple of different categories. Really, we should probably think about it more of a spectrum than as a hard and fast categories. So we could talk about at the easiest end of the spectrum in terms of reading assignments, something that's written for a popular audience or popular writing aimed at a general audience, right? So newspaper articles, stuff like The Atlantic or the National Review or The Economist. Some of those are, a little bit long-form journalism, but they're still aimed at a wide popular audience. They're written for a general audience. But in college, the sorts of readings that are most likely going to be assigned are more specialized. After all, the aim of higher education is to develop an understanding of a discipline or an area of study that's much more advanced than just general knowledge, right, of some basic ideas in that area. So the idea of higher education is to develop an advanced understanding of these various subjects that are a part of the curriculum. And that's going to mean that you're likely to be assigned more advanced readings, right? So stuff that's beyond just a newspaper article or a Time magazine article or something like that, right? for the most part. There are obviously exceptions to all these sorts of things. So again, I'm kind of speaking in generalities here. And so if you're wondering about my classes, here's some things that you might think about in terms of the readings that I might assign, and how strong or how difficult that might make the class for you, or how relatively easy the class might be for you, depending on the sort of reading that I might assign. And I've assigned all sorts of readings different semesters, even though it might have been the same class. And so I'll walk through some of that with you here, and I'll give some examples. So again, thinking of a spectrum where we have popular writings at the easiest side of that. They're aimed at a general audience. I think newspaper articles are written for something like an early high school level of reading. But in college, obviously, we have more advanced readings. And so on the other end of the spectrum, the more difficult end of the spectrum, we'd have stuff that's written for people that are specialists in a particular field, written for experts, basically. So the audience for those writings is totally different. And because of that, the style of writing and the kind of technical level of that writing is going to be different, right? So if you were an engineering student, for example, you might think about how, if you were an engineer explaining stuff at a public meeting about a bridge or something like that, how you might speak differently to that audience in terms of the technicalities of what you're working on versus a room full of city engineers or urban planners or something like that, right? So easiest side of the spectrum, newspaper articles. I teach philosophy, right, as I mentioned, and so for a popular writing about philosophy, you could go and look at something like the New York Times' The Stone blog, which is a blog where different contemporary philosophers write for a popular audience, a wide general audience, about some philosophical topic. So that's kind of at the lower end of the spectrum. So, I wouldn't shy away from maybe assigning one or two things from something like The Stone. Just as an example here, I happen to have, I just recalled, so this is a collection of essays from that New York Times Stone blog here, and they're all collected. They're relatively short and they're relatively non-technical, although they're still philosophical in nature, so there's a little bit of difficulty involved in that just by itself. But I probably wouldn't assign that whole book for one college level class, even just a lower level one. I might assign it as a few readings or some supplemental readings, just because the aim of the class, again, is to develop a more advanced understanding of the subject matter, even if it's an introductory class, right? So with that in mind, then let's take a look at some of the different types of books or essays or writings that I might assign in a class, and that you could use to look at and compare to other professors in other classes or different classes that I might teach, right? And so again, just some general guidelines to look at when you're thinking about how difficult a class might be and trying to figure that out. Again, relative to your own strengths and weaknesses. And of course, you ought to try to pick a class that's going to challenge you a little bit, right? So above that kind of popular writing, even popular writing for philosophers, just maybe a hair above that, I'd think about something like this. This is a book called Rick and Morty and Philosophy. It's a pop culture and philosophy book. It comes from Open Court's series on pop culture and philosophy. Blackwell has a series as well. And they are a series of books that contain essays written by contemporary academic philosophers, but they're all, talking about philosophical issues as they're raised or illustrated in this TV show, Rick and Morty, and there's ones on The Office or The Hunger Games or The Matrix and Inception and, all sorts of things from pop culture. Those, that sort of, the essays in that book and in books like that, they are on philosophy, obviously, but they are largely non-technical, and they're appealing to examples that people might already be familiar with, right? Stuff in popular culture, like a TV show or a movie or something like that, and then using that to illustrate a basic philosophical idea. This is a book that is, to my mind, is primarily not aimed at, or designed to be really a college textbook, although, I've assigned some essays out of books like this in my own classes. It's not that I would never assign this book for a class, an entire class. As a matter of fact, I'm teaching an intercession class coming up here. By intercession, I mean a 2-week, 6-day-a-week class that meets 3.5 hours a day. It's an intensive class, and so I picked a book that I think is very accessible for that type of class, because I don't want people having to spend 3 hours outside of class if they're spending 3.5 hours in class trying to dig through some difficult reading. So it's not that I would never assign something like this, but in a regular semester class, a 15, 16-week class, I probably wouldn't assign this whole thing, although depending on the circumstances, I might. Again, it introduces stuff in a very broad stroke way. It uses ready-at-hand examples, but it's not very technical at all, right? It's aimed, it kind of straddles the line between aiming at people that might have an interest in philosophy, obviously, but that don't have much of a background at all in philosophy. So aimed still at a very wide audience. But a low level of technicality in that writing, right? So, paints in broad strokes, that kind of thing. Slightly more advanced, I think, is a book like this. So this is a book that I have used it's Ethics Goes to the Movies by, let me see here, by Chris Falzone, who's, again, a philosophy professor. He wrote the entire book there. It's not a collection of essays or anything written by different people. But again, it's largely a non-technical book. It uses, again, pop culture, so examples that people are likely to be familiar with. And again, it paints in fairly large strokes. It goes over the basic idea, digs into some of the details of that basic idea, and then some basic criticisms of those ideas, and then uses movies to illustrate some of those ideas or points, or show how an ethical issue is raised, or how some event in a movie, a fictional example, how a particular theory would analyze that particular issue. But it's largely non-technical. Right, and again, this is, I think, again, I assigned this for my not junior level, it's a sophomore level general education ethics course, a moral philosophy course. This is the book that I've been using the last couple of semesters. Again, to my mind, it is the easiest, most accessible book that I've ever used in a regular semester philosophy course, but not terribly technical. And what I mean by that in terms of philosophy is that the book is light on argumentation. It talks about basic idea again, and then basic criticism. It doesn't do a lot of laying out formal arguments or anything like that. And so when I talk about technical writing in philosophy, not always, but much of the time, what that is going to mean in academic philosophy is going to be laying out formal arguments and analyzing particular premises of those arguments and that kind of thing. So again, a book that uses pop culture and is non-technical, but aimed at a college classroom, as opposed to this, which is a little bit lighter, right? Even in terms of the technicality of the writing. Right. So next, again, slightly more difficult. I have another example. Here's another textbook. It's one that I use regularly in my Introduction to Philosophy classes. This book is written by a single author. It does contain, at the beginning of each chapter, a selection of a primary source, influential piece of writing from a philosopher in the history of Western philosophy. But the rest of the book, the bulk of the book, is that author working through and explaining those ideas. That particular author does so in a slightly more technical way than in this book, because what he does is he actually walks through the key premises of each argument. He just covers one basic argument for each of the main views that he covers in the book, but he does walk through in a more precise and technical way the basic premises of each argument, some of the sub arguments that support those premises in the main argument, and then criticisms that attack particular premises in those arguments. So slightly more technical, but still a book that uses pop culture and examples that are going to be, more widely available to the audience, right? So most people have seen The Matrix by now, for example, and that's one of the examples that he uses. So slightly more technical, but again, using examples that are going to be more widely known. Then we have another layer of difficulty, more advanced. We might have a book like one of these. So Bernard Williams' very short introduction to philosophy. Bernard Williams is an influential moral philosopher that died several years ago now, but died in the 21st century. It's well known for his contributions on personal identity and moral philosophy. Then another textbook, again, slightly longer, more technical than the pop culture stuff. In fact, neither of these books involve pop culture really at all. They are much more more technical in their analysis of the positions that they discuss. They don't focus on giving a lot of examples from current events or anything like that. But both of these books are still aimed at lower level college classes, right? But both of them. So again, something that I would have no problem, no qualms about assigning either of these sorts of books and expecting incoming college students to be able to make their way through those, right? But again, books that are written by single authors and aimed kind of at an introductory level, but an introductory level that's in a college setting, in an academic setting. So more technical in their analysis of various positions. And then, to my mind, the works that students tend to struggle with the most are works that are either anthologies of or collections of primary source and other scholarly writings, right? So like something by Plato, and then maybe a scholarly article written for other scholars about Plato, right? So stuff that's aimed at that more specialized audience, right? But again, here my first example, right, is Ethics by Kant here. This is an anthology that is a collection of primary sources from contemporary philosophers, right? No pop culture examples in this stuff, really. Aimed at persuading people for various positions and engaging criticisms and trying to work out which of the positions is the strongest there in a more technical way. But it's filled with stuff and selections from primary sources and scholarly articles. And so this is kind of this is the other end of the spectrum from that popular writing stuff, or even that Rick and Morty textbook that I gave the example of. This is a book that many students would have a more difficult time with, but it's still aimed. And it's on the back of it talks about this is a comprehensive collection for undergraduates, right? For people that are new to philosophy, but it's a collection of primary sources from Plato, Kierkegaard, Kant, and then contemporary thinkers like Bernard Williams or Alistair McIntyre, and so it's work that people would struggle with to get through a little bit more. But stuff, I've assigned this book in the same class, the same course, different semester, different year, that I assign this in, right? So again, something that many people might find more difficult to get through, but that that I would feel totally comfortable assigning for in a class, right? And that you may find other professors assigning this very sort of thing, right? Here's another example of that same kind of textbook. So this one is by Sturba. It's again an edited anthology of contemporary and historical texts, primary sources on ethics. And then, of course, you have something like this, which is a complete work by a contemporary philosopher um, on moral on morality, right? So, for example, it wouldn't be unheard of to have a selection of this book contained in a book like this. This book. Another professor at the university that I teach in the class, the ethics class that he teaches, that's the same course, right? Different section. He assigns 3 books like this, right? And that's perfectly, you know, there's nothing wrong with that. That's what he's permitted to do in terms of how he wants to structure his class. It's just not what I choose to do. So I'm been assigning this. I'm pretty happy with it. My lectures are more technical than this textbook, but the reading itself is fairly accessible, I think, especially compared to that book like something like this. And I mention that because it's I just got finished looking at my teaching evaluations for the last semester, and several comments on there where the reading is too difficult, and it was from this class, the ethics course, where I assigned this book, which to my mind, it's the easiest, most accessible, least technical writing assignments, or excuse me, reading assignments that I've assigned in a course. So my point is that someone is bound to find it difficult no matter what I do, right? But what you need to worry about when you're picking a course is what you're going to be able to manage, right? And so again, thinking about whether the professor is assigning lots and lots of more technical stuff or less technical stuff, or a variety of those sorts of things, by looking at that syllabus and the reading schedule, and just, you know, kind of looking a few things up online, you can get an idea of how difficult that course will be for you, given your reading comprehension skills and the time that you have to devote to the course. And so that's just one thing that you ought to look at when you're trying to figure out how difficult a class is going to be. You could go to the professor and ask how difficult is your class, but of course he's thinking about it in terms of what he's done over the years, you know. And so my class now, I think of the way I've been doing my ethics course and even my introduction to philosophy course the last couple of semesters. It's the easiest version that I've done of those, to my mind. And so when students tell me that the class is too hard, you know, it's difficult for me to take that very seriously because I know what I've done previously. What you need to do then, when you're worried about how difficult a class may be, is to contact the professor or take a look at their syllabus, and then look up a little bit about whatever books they're assigning, and try and figure out, are they less technical stuff? Are they more technical stuff? Is it all very highly technical stuff that you might encounter in an upper level class, even if it's an upper level elective? You got to remember that you might be taking it as an elective, but other people are in there because it's part of their major. And so that class is going to be much more difficult. The reading is going to be likely to be much more technical than an introductory level course. But again, in an introductory level course, those professors that we're free to assign basically whatever we want, so long as it's appropriate to the level of the class. And quite frankly, again, in college, the idea of a reading level pretty much goes out the window, because, you know, we're here to introduce students to a subject matter in a much more advanced level. So that's just something you need to keep in mind, and a few tips for trying to think about what to consider when you're trying to figure out what kind of classes you're going to take in a particular semester and how difficult that class might be for you. So I hope that you found that helpful. There are other things to consider as well, types of requirements. Maybe I'll make another video on that sort of thing if people find this kind of thing useful. Take care. That's all for me for today. I know I've probably been long-winded already. Y'all have a good one. Stay safe. And if you're watching this during the pandemic, still, you know, wash your hands. Y'all have a good one.